1 year ago, the very first place my book, Hate the Game, hit shelves wasn't at a local boutique. It was at O'Hare International Airport. And within months, it was an airport bestseller, sitting on the shelves at Hudson newsstands right next to Malcolm Gladwell, Michael Lewis, and even Beyonce's mom, Tina Knowles. So, how did a first time author with no celebrity status manage to get her book onto the most competitive shelf space in the world? Today, I'm breaking down the data and explaining the strategy behind how that happened and how you could make your book into an airport bestseller. At the end of this video, I'll tell you exactly how many copies I sold, and those numbers might surprise you. So, first off, why do airports matter so much for book sales? Well, most people today shop for books online. They might hear about a book from a friend and then go look on Amazon or bookshop.org to find that book that they know that they want. People don't really browse for books in bookstores as often as they used to. But airport travelers who have, say, an hour before their flight boards are looking for something to entertain them. They're looking for entertainment while they're waiting for their flight, and they're looking for something that can hold their attention during that flight. Maybe they'll find a book that changes them completely and they get off that flight a different person than when they got on. And as an author, this is an incredibly important space to be in. Over 250,000 travelers go through O'Hare Airport every single day. And if you manage to get your book into stores and airports all across the country, you have an audience of millions. And you're not facing very much competition when you're in that bookshelf space. Hudson newsstands only have 20 or 30 books displayed. So you have lots of potential buyers looking at your book and not much competition. So that means the likelihood of them picking up your book, even if they've never heard of it before, is quite high. So how do you get your book into an airport bookstore? The first step is to pick the right genre. Not every genre is in airport bookstores. You'll notice that it's mostly self-help, business books, and thrillers. Those are the kinds of books that hold a promise. When you pick up a thriller, it might be so scary that you are a changed person by the time you are done reading it. Same is true for self-help. It has this promise that after you read this book, you will transform into a different person. And business books are the same thing. Maybe after reading that business book, you will have an idea for a business that will change your entire life. These types of genres tend to do well in airports because travelers are going on trips for the purpose of having a changed experience. Whether it's a vacation or a business trip, travelers are hoping that they are going through the hassle of getting on that flight and going across the country or across the world to have an experience that will change their life. And part of that experience involves what they read on that flight. So if your book is outside one of those genres that promises to change your mind, it probably isn't going to end up in airport bookstores. Okay, so you've happened to write a book that is within one of the genres that does appear in airport bookstores. How do you get those buyers for Hudson newsstands to pick your book? Now, because Hudson News essentially has a monopoly over airport bookstores, it's important that you pick a publisher who is connected to Hudson News, who can get your book at least in front of that book buyer. Unfortunately, self-published books are not going to make it into airport bookstores, but you don't necessarily need to go with a top 5 publisher. My publisher was the University of Chicago Press, which is a relatively small academic press, but they had connections to Hudson News stores, so that's all that mattered. If you look at books sold in airports, you'll notice a lot of them are from those top 5 publishers, but you'll also see Harvard Business Review there. So going with a smaller publisher doesn't rule you out from airport bookstores. And if you're going with a big publisher, you're going to have to compete against all of their big-time authors. Those big publishers are going to prioritize the authors that have gotten the largest advances because they need to see a return on investment. So sometimes it can help to go with a smaller publisher because it might mean that you get more attention and more of a push from them when they are marketing your book to those airport bookstores. So, how do you get an airport bookstore to pick your book to put on display? Well, you're actually not going to multiple bookstores. It's really just Hudson News that has a monopoly over all airport bookstores. They might have different branding, like in Chicago, there's Barbara bookstores, but it's actually just one buyer that is selecting the books to go in those airports all across the country. And they're looking for books that will sell. And back to my earlier point, they're looking for books that contain that promise that your life will be changed by the time you are done reading it. So if you want your book to be selected, make sure you put that promise in the title. My book is titled Hate the Game: Economic Cheat Codes for Life, Love, and Work. In that subtitle is the promise that my book contains the cheat codes that will improve your life, love, and work. That's a promise that when you are done reading this book, you will know things that could potentially change every aspect of your life. And that made my title the kind of thing that Hudson News would want to display. But it doesn't just stop at the title. That promise has to continue into the front matter. When airport travelers are browsing books at a Hudson newsstand, they'll often pick a book off the shelf and thumb through the first dozen or so pages before deciding whether they want to spend $25 or more purchasing the book and bringing it on their flight. So in those first dozen pages, you need to hammer home that promise that this book is going to be worth reading. This book is going to change that reader's life. So the way that I did this in my author's note is I told the story of the time that I read Freakonomics and explained how reading that book changed my life. It made me want to become an economist. I didn't pick that story just because I knew it would work well for airports. I actually wasn't thinking about that. I was just trying to start my book at the very beginning. My book is about how I made career choices using the mind of an economist to advance my career. And that journey started when I decided to become an economist. And I decided to become an economist after reading Freakonomics on an airplane. So this worked really well. I talk about how my dad gave me Freakonomics. I brought it on a plane. I read the book. I decided to become an economist, and it changed my life. When reading that author's note, readers start to put themselves in my position, and they start to hope that this book that they're reading, which happens to be my book, will change their life in a similar way. And I think this is why Hudson News selected my book to put on its newsstands. Now, that promise should be in that front matter, but that front matter also needs a hook. A hook is something that makes the reader want to keep reading. So the way that I hook my readers is really through my personality as a narrator. I wrote the author's note in this style that's kind of braggadocious, kind of cocky, and that's because I wanted the reader to think in their mind, who the F does this lady think she is? Because if they're thinking that, they're going to want to keep reading to find out. Now, this isn't going to work for every author, but you need to have something that hooks the reader, that puts a question in their mind, that makes them want to keep reading so that they have that question answered. They won't have that question answered if they put the book back on the shelf. The only way they can get the answer is to buy the book and keep on reading. And eliminate anything that might stop you from buying that book, like being too boring, being too jargony, too complex, too big. So these two elements, having a promise and a hook, is what got my book selected by Hudson News to display in airport bookstores. The book was selected 6 months before it was even ready to be published, before I even had a cover. So although the cover does matter a lot in terms of getting a reader to pick up your book and actually read it, Hudson News did not have the cover when they selected my book. That came later. So it was in summer 2024 when I got the news from my editor that my book was going to be bought by Hudson News to be displayed in airport bookstores. And this was when my publisher went all in on making sure that my book was actually going to sell. The designer got to work on the cover, and the cover is critically important. It needs to visually represent that promise that by the time you finish reading this book, your life will be changed. And honestly, I think the designer did an excellent job. The cover is graphic, it's easy to read, so you see that catchy title of Hate the Game from far away. It has this Candyland style board game on it, so you immediately know that this book is about playing games. And it has this line cutting through Candyland to represent the cheat codes that will get you to your goals faster. And when airport travelers go to pick up the book at the Hudson newsstand, they're going to see even more that makes them want to read it. It has this really striking cover that's white on the front and black on the back. And on the back, you'll see that it has all of these blurbs from famous people like Stephen Levitt, the author of Freakonomics, Angela Yee, who is a former host of The Breakfast Club, and also Nobel Prize winner Roger Myerson, and Dean of the Yale School of Management, Kerwin Charles. All people endorsing the book who are reaffirming that, yes, this book fulfills the promise that it makes to readers. The book is also the right size, coming in at just over 270 pages. It's the kind of thing that you could read on just one flight. And it's also lightweight. You can just stick it in your bag and it won't take up all that much space or be too heavy. So the bottom line is that you want to put yourself in the headspace of that airport traveler. Think about what would make you stop and pick up a book. What titles would catch your eye? What promises would you be looking for? Okay, so let's talk numbers. What does being an airport bestseller actually mean? So 6 months before my book even came out, Hudson News committed to ordering 2,500 copies. 1,000 copies would go right on the shelves, and the other 1,500 would go into storage. Now, it's important to note that just because they ordered 2,500 copies does not mean that all of those copies were going to sell. The way that publishing works is that bookstores often order more copies than they need because they are allowed to return books to the publisher. They do have to pay for shipping costs, though, so they tried to get that number to be as accurate as possible, but if they go over a bit, they know they can just return it. So the fact that Hudson News ordered 2,500 copies of my book before it was even released was huge, because 90% of traditionally published books don't even sell 1,000 copies. So right away, I was in that top 10% just because I got Hudson News to buy my book. Now, it's been a year, and my publisher tells me that I have sold just a little over 6,000 hardcovers of my book, Hate the Game, with over 1,000 in ebook sales. I don't know what the audiobook sales are because that part of the publishing world is really opaque, and I probably won't find out until I start to get sales statements. But the minimum that I've sold is over 7,000 copies. And that might not sound like a lot, but it's actually better than about 95% of traditionally published books. I've also sold the rights for my book to be translated and sold in South Korea, China, and Taipei. Those translations haven't come out yet, but getting that advance has added to the potential sales that this book will get in the end. So those sales were enough to get my book, Hate the Game, the number 17 spot on the airport bestseller shelf. I remember one day I was traveling through the airport, walking through O'Hare, and I saw my book on literally every single newsstand I walked past. Right next to the Gatorade and the chips and those nasty tuna fish sandwiches was my book, cover out, ready to be bought. And that's the kind of marketing that you just can't buy. It's better than a billboard. It's better than an Amazon ad. Having that book in bookstores meant that millions of travelers saw the cover and at least had the opportunity to consider buying my book. It also ranked on a couple other lists. It was a business bestseller according to Success Magazine and an academic bestseller as well. It didn't make it onto any of those other name brand lists like the New York Times bestseller list or the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. And from what I heard, the reason is that books sold in airports actually don't count towards those bestseller calculations. But to be honest, I never really cared about my book being a bestseller. What I really wanted to accomplish was writing a book that I would be proud of, the kind of book that I would have wanted to read. And I accomplished that the minute that I sent over the draft to my editor. That's how I knew that this book was a success. It's definitely been a nice bonus to have my book be an airport bestseller, but it's been even nicer to hear from readers who felt like the book really did fulfill its promise, that it really did change their life. I've heard from multiple people who've said that my book is their favorite book of all time. And that's the kind of feedback that lets me know that this book was truly worth writing. And there are some other signifiers of success that let me know this book was worthwhile. I got a call from Beyonce's dad, Matthew Knowles, commending me on writing the book, and I never imagined that would happen. I also just joined Planet Money on their book tour. Planet Money featured my book in an episode when it came out, and it was such a pleasure to come out and support them for their book. Writing books doesn't pay a lot in direct sales, but it does pay off because it gives you clout, and clout is really valuable. I don't care what anybody says. It's increased my value to my employer, Redfin. It's increased my value in the marketplace. And even though I'm not going to become one of those authors that makes money off of speaking fees or consulting, this book is really paying off just in terms of my own brand value. It got you to click on this video, right? So those are my tips for how to write an airport bestseller. Make sure you're in the right genre. Make sure you're working with a publisher who has connections to Hudson News. Make a promise that your book will change your reader's life, and include a hook that makes the reader want to keep on reading. It also helps to have a snazzy cover that catches your reader's eye. So if you have any more questions about how the book publishing industry works or how I wrote my book, I'd be happy to answer them. Just leave them in the comments. And if I get enough comments, I'll make another video. Like this video, subscribe. YouTube has this thing called hype points, so give me some of those hype points, and stick around for the next video. I'm Daryl Fairweather, Chief Economist of Redfin and author of Hate the Game.